Welcome to the Power Shift Decolonising Development, the podcast series seeking to bring together thinkers, practitioners, and activists to share ideas, inspire change, and identify tools for practical action. I'm Professor Kate Bird, a socioeconomist and director of the Development Hub. Today's co-host is Dr. Nompilo Ndlovu. Over to you, Nompilo.
Thank you, Kate. I am Dr. Nompilo Ndlovu. I am a Zimbabwean living and working in South Africa. I'm an oral historian who applies gender frameworks to my work with communities in Africa. Recent work has included involvement in a mixed method study on poverty dynamics in Zimbabwe, where I led the work on gender and marginalization. My PhD focused on mass violence, memory, and local transitional justice in post-colonial Zimbabwe. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks, Nompilo. Today we're talking to Kenza Ben Azouz, an intersectional feminist, qualitative researcher, and recent addition to the Dev Hub team. Kenza is a gender expert trained in feminist research and anthropology from Tunisia. She's worked with various human rights and development organizations, both grassroots and international, across West and North Africa and Southwest Asia. Her work has mostly focused on gender-based violence, systemic racism, and structural development challenges. Kenza holds a BA in political science and philosophy from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and an MA in social anthropology of development from SOAS University in London, the UK. Kenza is also a yoga teacher and contemporary dancer. And I would encourage you to take a look at the show notes below to find out more about Kenza and have a look at her on our website as well. So, Nompilo, I'm going to hand back to you to ask the first initial questions.
Okay. Hello, Kenza. It's great to meet you again today. I wonder if we can start our conversation today by you telling the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Kate, for the introduction, and thank you, Nompilo. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself a little bit outside of my bio and professional description. So, as you mentioned, Kate, I'm from Tunisia. I'm actually French Tunisian, and I spent most of my life in Tunisia until I traveled internationally for work and for educational purposes, so I never lived in France. That's a bit about me. And you've mentioned also my academic background, and I would like to state again, come back to this experience of conducting a master's in social anthropology of development, because truly, I think this is where my self-concept kind of deepened, and I was able to extract myself from the setting I grew up in and worked in order to reflect more on who I am. And this is where I realized that I wasn't just French Tunisian, but I'm actually mixed race, white Arab woman. And I use this master's as an opportunity to look at Blackness and whiteness in Tunisia and understand the coloniality of race issues, how Africanity is understood within Tunisia, how normalized and invisibilized whiteness is within Tunisia. This has really been a self-discovery journey through the academic, but also very personal lens. I've gotten really interested in understanding the politics of beauty, the coloniality, and the legacies of not only trans-Saharan slavery in North Africa or the Maghreb, but also how current geopolitical contemporary settings are informing anew how race is created and hierarchies are maintained. And I think also, in addition to my academic background, a lot of my interpersonal relationships have informed how I understand myself. And I think, both of you come from a region that for me has contributed a lot. I have a Tunisian family living in South Africa and an excellent friend who is colored, which, I think this interactivity and reflecting on the relationality of race has really helped me understand how both the oppressed and the oppressor live within me as a white Arab woman. So in a nutshell, this is what I would like to add about myself and how I perceive myself.
All righty. Thank you for that. Kenza, you started your professional life working in the humanitarian sector. I can actually understand that quite a bit because that was my initial journey. Could you tell us a bit about your experiences of the sector, the driver to withdraw from full-time work in the sector, and the personal and professional journey you have been on since?
Sure. So I started my experience quite young, actually, professionally joining the humanitarian setting. I think because of my advantage speaking multiple languages, I was able to kind of jump into the sector at quite a young and uninformed age, I believe. So I got the chance to work in Greece in the migration response on different islands, which was very much like a microcosm of very macro global politics and European racism and border controls and racialization within very clear kind of structured orders in camps and refugee settings. After that, I've also worked in West Africa, especially in Nigeria, working on very large-scale cash interventions. And frankly, I don't very much associate to this professional setting anymore, which is also why it's not part of my bio, for a diversity of reasons which have been well established and studied. So, classically a very thorough white saviorism that I was witnessing also at a young age, so still quite surprised. And then I think, aside from this very clear white saviorist agenda, interference, failed interventions that are then recast into different descriptions that are supposed to make interventions look coherent and sensitive, while very often reproducing certain forms of neo-colonial agendas. Personally, what I was witnessing the most was practices that felt very capitalistic and extractivist. So ultimately, I felt like I was working more into a financial institution trying to advance its goals and working day and night with certain forms of abuse and self-abuse among the staff that were completely normalized, certain self-concepts also as being expatriates and having this certain very normalized form of privileges. So I think actually the factors were very multifaceted, and I think it's only through time and hindsight and retrospectively that I kind of understood why I had escaped this universe and why it didn't correspond to what kind of social impact I was trying to have. And I felt like I was actually replicating what I did not want to be contributing to. Of course, there are programs that do have very positive and interesting settings, but I don't think I had the chance to work on the most critically and self-aware projects that are now kind of emerging thanks to feminist leadership also on these issues and trying to modify some of the practices. So yeah, I did personally observe a lot of bullying from being a young woman within these settings, practices, white normativity, and also on a very personal front, in 2019, my best friend, who was also an aid worker, and her Nigerian partner were murdered. And this is obviously a very complex setting and situation configuration in which it happened. But on a completely personal note, I felt like there had been potentially a lack of duty of care or security concerns that weren't addressed as it should be. And I think for me, that was very much a deep awakening call to be very intentional about my reflections around what I was doing professionally, what I was trying to achieve, at what cost, and how and why, and what we were losing into this on a very molecular level almost. I think I had been made aware, and I was critical in my thinking, but I wasn't feeling into the bones as this trauma and grief had forced me to do. And it's still taking years and I'm still comprehending this, but I think this has radically changed my approach to how I want to work and honor also these people. So yeah, coming back to the life trajectory on a more dinner phrase, after this I was able to work more into human rights sector actually, which is very different in some ways from humanitarianism, because I found that the ethos was very much individuals feeling quite useless actually, because they're using frameworks that sometimes are very difficult to have a very concrete impact. So the attitude was quite different from humanitarianism, white saviorism, where people are thinking that they're here to be very much the stars and game changers and the big negotiators with donors, etc. So the power dynamic, the self-reflectivity also is different. And I was able to analyze human rights through also my academic background in social anthropology, so bringing a more critical lens, etc. So I found a lot of interest in there. And since I've also been working as a consultant, so having more agency in terms of how I both display my working hours, the specific issues I want to work with, how I interrelate with individuals. And I found a lot of opportunities to reclaim more of myself in the work that I'm doing. Of course, there are pitfalls to be avoided and negotiations are constant. But yeah, luckily I've had the privilege of being able to, at a young age, withdraw from the institutions where I found substructural constraints that couldn't allow me to feel as I was completely aligned with what I believed in and why I was doing this work. Sorry, long answer.
Not at all. Thank you for sharing such personal and traumatic experiences. And, they're a reminder of so many different people who have come in and just shared what structural power, positionality has done, especially in some of these huge organizations. I really just wanted to draw on two things that you said before I move on to the next question, if that's okay. I just like that you spoke about how your use of different languages and your understanding of them and your identity as something of a skill set. which I definitely think when we start talking about a decolonial era, then we understand that a skill set isn't necessarily a degree, but your ability to move in and out of spaces and your ability to hear what the person on the ground is saying because of intuitive language ability or an intuition about what identity means. So I really like that you already started touching on that ageism, the role of being in the humanitarian sector, which is run on ageism, and how that also impacts everything. But more than that, I often hear a lot of us when we start talking about culture of care as professionals, will often try to not only focus on rest, but you have been very clear from the onset. You're very much about yoga. You're very much about reflection and stuff. And I'm really enjoying this move where we start seeing feminists being okay about the fact that they use the creative side of themselves as actually part of their skill set and decolonial practice, and a part of culture of care for themselves. So I really just like that as pronounced, because we often think the softer skills are not important, but they actually are more. So I really just like that thought process. Let me move on to the next question. You draw on Black feminisms, female power, passion, personal interests. You explore how this can bring the whole selves to their lives and work, similarly to some of the comments I've shared. So can you tell us a little bit more about this and why you believe that women taking rest is a revolutionary and decolonizing act?
Sure, thank you for the question. So Black feminism is a treasure. I've had the chance to be exposed to quite young through my academic studies, but I think I was still into a fallacy of formativity, capitalism kind of performance that didn't allow me to really let that sink into my body and mind, into life, and how I structured the architecture of my life. But recently, I think having the ability to not only gain more time through consulting, but also having more fluidity in terms of how this time was managed, and also I think some degree of aloneness, or not being constantly surrounded by individuals who were maintaining these roles and structures, having kind of this isolation allowed me to rethink how I wanted to use this spare time that I was creating. And so therein, I was able to dig a little bit deeper into dance and yoga, and to also be very decolonial in my approach to dance and yoga, not seeing it as a leisure, or again, these are spaces that can be extremely violent, also reinforce trauma, racism, creating hierarchies of bodies, white supremacy. These are things that I noticed definitely almost as much in yoga as in humanitarian work. So I was able to create something that was kind of merging both my experiences, my view of race issues, and Black feminism, and particularly Audre Lorde's work on the erotic force and the power of this force. And what is meant here is really this contact with, or intuition with, at a very cellular level, a power that all individuals hold, but women in particular, because of their history of marginalization, ancestral practices, etc. So, there's a whole field to jump into in there, but in a nutshell, it was about deconstructing kind of the white fathers, as she describes it, very linear, rigid, so-called objective approach to life, and kind of bringing other women into a space where they're able to allow themselves to have very multiple dimension, and to kind of put on hold this pursuit of a coherent kind of profile background and practice. So both in terms of movement and what we're doing into that space, but also to reflect into their lives, where they're letting themselves be small, rejecting certain emotions, etc. And as part of that is also rest. So tuning into where we're abusing ourselves and letting go some of our power because we want to perform something, and to really see how we can be more into our own sensations. And I do think rest is, in this sense, vital to women, to their self-care, to their ability to then live on in a healthy and integral way. But I just want to clarify that I don't believe that it is in itself revolution. I think it is necessary to being revolutionary, but it is not sufficient. I think we should look at it as something very complementary, although that said, rest is disruptive, and simply creating this space, allowing conversations around this, can be something that especially women who suffer more from an imposter syndrome, etc., are less likely, I believe, to partake into discussing. Otherwise, I believe they'd be labeled as lazy or whatever capitalistic narrative we want to launch onto it. But yeah, I do think it is deeply, deeply necessary to have that space, and to then be able to reflect and act differently. But yeah, it is not sufficient, I would say.
Thank you for that very deep thought. I will hand over to you, Kate, to proceed further.
So, Kenza, I just want to reflect a little bit on some of the things that you've told us. I really like the philosophy that you're bringing to your work, and the way that you take a very integral approach and you're bringing your whole self to the work. That's something I really appreciate. And I love the words that you used earlier in the interview where you were talking about reclaiming yourself. And I think a very large part of decolonizing ourselves, and I would include white people in that, because white people have also internalized all the structures of white supremacy, and that's very damaging for our minds and our bodies as well. So I think we all need to reclaim ourselves. And I love the ideas behind Ubuntu leadership, where we bring our whole selves to work. And the approach that you're talking about is that work is there, and work is part of life, and revolution is part of life. And you're bringing your whole self to your life. You're not just bringing your whole self to your work, but you're bringing your whole self to your life. And work is part of life, but it's not the whole of life. And I like the way that when you're thinking about rest and the revolutionary action of rest and taking rest, it's taking a pause so that you can show up more fully. And I really like that. And you mentioned imposter syndrome just towards the end of your last response to Nompilo. And I've thought quite a bit about imposter syndrome, because in the past I've really experienced it very, very strongly. And I think that perhaps imposter syndrome is more experienced, certainly by women than by men. Having spoken to women of color, it's experienced very strongly by women of color. And I think it's more reflective of people who are sensitive to the messages that they are being given by those around them. So when women experience microaggressions in the form of patriarchy, or where people of color are experiencing racist microaggressions, if you experience imposter syndrome, it's simply that you are sensitive to the messaging that you are being given. And while you might be being told to toughen up and man up about the environment that you're in, you're simultaneously being told not to be you. You're being told to present yourself in a male way or present yourself in a white way. So you are actually code switching. You're being asked to code switch and to be different. And if you have a feeling of discomfort, it's the dissonance between your true self, your whole self, and showing up as you truly are. And I think in working to bring anti-racist thinking into organizations and into the work that we do in global development and humanitarian action and the feminist movement, then surely we want to turn up as our whole selves. And imposter syndrome, I think, is a nonsense, because it's just a flag. It's a red flag that's coming up and saying something's going on here. We need to pay attention. So that's just my reflection on what you've been saying. And one of the things I've really enjoyed listening to you and in talking to you in our prior conversations before this podcast is that when I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking to somebody who is a properly trained anthropologist. I'm an economist. So you're putting words and structures to kind of fuzzy feelings that I've got. You've actually got the analytical tools to go, hey, this is what's happening. I'm going, yes. Oh my God, yes, that's it. You've nailed it. So I absolutely love the way that you've described things in the interview so far, because it really resonates with me. And the rejection of capitalistic self-exploitation really speaks to me. I love that, because I think we all need a bit of that. But I'd like to move on to my next question now, and that is to ask you if you can tell us a little bit more about what has influenced your worldview. So you told us previously that you are mixed race or biracial, you are Arabic French. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that experience and how you think it has influenced you in your work and in your life.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We're too rarely asked to reflect about this quite openly, and I think there's a lot of value in it. So, as I mentioned before, in Tunisia, the language of race is very much erased in a similar way to France, and this is also in colonial legacy and colonial tool also to deprive us from the ability to talk about race. And if you casually mention race in Tunisia, or there also feel comfortable and generalize to say North Africa, you're perceived as being racist, actually, which is, quite a typical setting that is also the case in France. So, you'll have a basic race colorblind approach of saying, it's not okay to discuss race. So this has really been an impediment to generational and collective reflection on this matter. I do think that now things are slowly starting to evolve. But basically through Tunisia's history as a French protectorate and basically colony of France, Tunisia and the wider region were very much phrased as, white Africa. This was the part of Africa that could be salvaged or reappropriated to look more like us, as in Europeans. And so even in post-colonial era in Tunisia, the dictators that we had, whether Habib Bourguiba or followed by Ben Ali, have very much tried to maintain this myth of which was either through the erasure of Black Tunisians who constitute, it's difficult to put figures on race because it's such a relative and relational concept. But about 10 to 15% of Tunisia's population is Black. And there's a reluctancy to see that and to completely integrate and reflect this composition of Tunisia's body because it is so keen to perceive itself as white Arabs. So there's this element, but the other side of the coin is that also Tunisians are unaware of their own whiteness. So of course, in contact with other whites or French in Tunisia, they do perceive that they are not the same. So it's this constant reimagining of the self that has been theorized quite wonderfully also in Lebanon by Hassan Haj, Sarah Ahmed, Palestinian Australian feminist, has done incredible work on how whiteness infiltrates our bodies and minds in a very invisible way. And I think for me, because I'm French Tunisian, it was quite, in some ways, even harder to identify how whiteness was expressing itself in me and how I was expressing it onto myself and onto the world around me, because it was something I didn't have to reflect on because I just felt like I was half white and mixed, but I wasn't able to really pinpoint how the dialectic between being both really manifested in myself. And I'm still reflecting very much onto it, but I do think that even entering academia, it took me a really long time, and it's still very recent to feel like I was legitimate to partake into certain conversation because perhaps I didn't speak in the exact language that I thought I needed to speak with, or I didn't perform, or also physically present myself as a certain upper class white body that I thought I had to be in order to access certain ranks of academic conversations that I was pursuing, etc. And again, this speaks to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the white father's fallacy of a certain rationality and linearity and completely objective and kind of asepticized version of myself that I thought I needed to become. Really, this is a very circular conversation for me that I do believe and do hope it will never end, because it is allowing me to constantly reflect on myself and see how race is and will continue to manifest within me.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I know that you're joining us here today from Colombia, and you're in Colombia at the moment for a series of dance workshops, which I think is a truly wonderful reason to be in Colombia. I was in Colombia just over a year ago, and dance permeates everything. If people have a chance to dance in a restaurant, if there's a space in a restaurant, they'll stand up and dance. If there's a pause in a workshop, they'll stand up and dance. It's a very dancey place. So I love the fact that that's why you're there and that's what you're doing in Colombia. And you've traveled such a long distance to go and do that. I think it's a really beautiful thing. So for me, that's an indication of the way that you are integrating your whole self into your work and the way you live your life as a radical reclaiming and an avoiding of exploitation and self-exploitation, which is such a big feature of the global development and humanitarian sectors, I think. Before we finish up our interview, we've talked a lot about, self-reflection and race and identity and positionality. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you feel your understanding influences the way you engage with qualitative research, because you are a qualitative researcher, and one of your specialist areas is to do a very thoughtful qualitative research, and you also use qualitative tools and methods in monitoring and evaluation and in your work as a feminist. So I wonder if you could just apply some of what you've been telling us so far and some of the technical professional skills that you have, and talk to our audience about how the lens that you have that is looking at race and power and patriarchy influences your selection of tools and the way that you work.
Thank you for the question. So I've had a big chance to work at multiple occasions with someone who I consider as an angel for me in qualitative research. Her name's Kim Wilson, and I've had the chance to be introduced to quite original tools of data collection, whether it involved actually drawing with different research participants, or also expressing their perspectives of their lives through life charts. And what we were doing was to erase the kind of linear filter that we can sometimes quite unconsciously impose upon research participants when we're conducting interviews. So this has allowed me to kind of see the multiple facets in their lives, seeing also how I could analyze information that they were providing, describing themselves, but also the milieu from which they were talking, their emotions, their look, the way they were holding themselves, speaking to me. So I've taken to the habit of describing not only the information that I was being told or receiving or extracting sometimes, but actually trying to expose myself, also how I also was presenting myself, how I interacted with research participants before and after, how power dynamics were also expressed within the research interaction itself. Yeah, and I think it's also staying very close to the words that participants use, although sometimes, most cases it has not been in their own language, there needs to be a translation, but using quite verbatim their expressions. And yeah, I've also had the chance to use photography. So these are some of the tools through which I try to reflect the multi-dimensionality of their lives. And there's also been a wonderful podcast I've listened to recently by Professor Cristalli, who is a feminist researcher I've had the chance to exchange on a few times about, again, the politics of beauty and how whiteness was reproduced in Tunisia and elsewhere, etc. And she spoke about, in that podcast, which I'll provide for the listeners in the description below the video, about how love is perceived in international politics and international relation politics and studies, etc., and how it is very often removed from research participants' lives. So it's as if it's something that they do not experience, or that we focus very much on conflict and violence. And in that way, we're kind of making them personas that reenact our description and analysis, very much coming from the global north, of their lives and dynamics, and erasing agency, individuality, and their own knowledge and epistemologies and embodied experiences. So it's still, luckily and excitingly, I still have a lot to learn in this domain, but hopefully I keep drawing dots between them. And I hope one day to use dance and embodied movement as part of a research practice. That would be very much a great opportunity for me to explore in the future.
That would be very interesting. So thank you for talking us through the toolbox that you use. And I'm really looking forward to actually working with you in a research project and seeing what I can learn from you and what I can teach you, and have a kind of two-way process of learning and sharing. I think that's going to be really lovely. So the last question is to ask you what, other than personal transformation and the inner work, you would recommend to our audience as the very first step that they could take, or the place where they could put their energy and drive if they want to contribute to anti-racism and decolonizing the global development and humanitarian sectors. So what's the first step, or what's the place they should put their energy from your perspective?
I think this is such an important question, because there is, among the few individuals who have the privilege and opportunity and curiosity to dig deeper into how they can contribute to decoloniality better, there is also, huge pressure and any risk of burnout, etc., with regards to certain feelings of powerlessness that we can feel. And I think what is important here is to connect very deeply the inner work and the outer work. The outer work is absolutely necessary, but both are equally vital as I see it. But I do think the outer work has to be defined by the inner work. By that I mean that individuals, through exploring the wounds of coloniality in themselves, should also learn to ideally understand what kind of senses are most important in their own composition, what they can actually do. I do think each of our objectives or abilities in terms of decoloniality have to be highly individual in order to be sensitive and very sincere. So activism will look like very different things for different individuals. For some, it would be physical protest outside. For others, it might be conversations, art, geeking into financial institutions and what alternatives we can find, how we can use our money better. So I do think we do need a very large cohort of skills and abilities, and especially find, there's a lot about joy activism out there. And I do think it's important to find the joy, but this joy also needs to be very intentional. It's about seeing what you can create, where you can find your very own purpose. Otherwise, I do think there is a risk of burning out, because the tasks are very large. So Yes, I would say it's about creativity, and if we do have the time, I would love to read a very short paragraph from Token Young that is called Decolonizing is Not a Metaphor. I read it in the context of a class on decolonizing yoga, and for me, it really hit the nail on the head. I don't know how we use this expression, but I would like to read it. So, we don't intend to discourage those who have dedicated careers and lives to teaching themselves and others to be critically conscious of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, xenophobia, and settler colonialism. We're asking them, you, to consider how the pursuit of critical consciousness, the pursuit of social justice through critical enlightenment, can also be settler moves to innocence. Diversions, distractions, which relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility and conceal the need to give up land or power or privilege. And I think this is extremely important because although there would be the pleasures of seeing what we can contribute, I think there needs to be a letting go. There needs to be a certain loss or something to be given away and shed away in order to free yourself from a certain privilege and to truly, both on an individual level, but also at an important symbolic level, give away some privilege, because as long as we keep on holding to this certain power, and this is a negotiation that has to be done constantly, seeing where actually I can let go a bit more of myself and provide for someone else. And of course, I cannot finish this interview without also using a reference to Audre Lorde's work, because it's been so important to my worldview. And I think here it's got a nice complementarity with this kind of materialistic and political contribution that is to be made. And it's from Poetry is Not a Luxury. So, our acts against oppression become integral with self, motivated and empowered from within. In touch with the erotic, I become less willing to accept powerlessness, or those other supplied states of being which are not native to me, such as resignation, despair, self-effacement, depression, and anxiety. So I think both concepts should really sink in and merge together in ourselves to find how we can both live out a decolonial agenda, but also a fuller and more meaningful life together.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. So in that last little bit, you talked about joy and nourishing yourself and living a full life. And I think that's such a great note to end on, because often when we're talking about social justice and social change, it feels quite hard. It feels like you're kind of trying to roll a great big boulder uphill. And if you stop in the work for just a second, it'll roll back and crush you. So what you're talking about is actually going with your strength, going with your talents and your skills. So if you're an artist, do art. If you're an activist who is comfortable in the form of active protest, go and do that. Embody who you are and do what you do, and join the social movement in terms of bringing your skills and yourself to that role. I think that's really lovely. And just thinking about that reminds me of a publication that Peace Direct did, which talked about the different roles that people can take in global development. And I will link to that in the show notes. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at the show notes, because we're going to link to the poems that Kenza has read, and also have a look at the transcript, because this session has been very, very rich in detail. Do take a look at the show notes. If you're interested, do sign up to our newsletter. You'll get links to all our recent podcasts. You'll get practical resources to decolonize your practice. Do remember to like and follow the podcast, find us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky Social, and see you again next time. Thank you so much for joining us, Kenza, and I'm really looking forward to working with you in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Kenza. We have a lot to think about, a lot of food for thought, and yeah, we look forward to continuing working with you at the Development Hub and exploring these ideas further. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you. It was truly a pleasure. Thank you again.